On Christmas Eve, in the year 1757, a detachment of about 80 light horsemen set out upon a secret mission. It was an extremely clear, windy night, and these men rode across an open plain in the Hanoverian domains, what today is northwest Germany, toward the sentries surrounding an enemy camp. Though clearly illuminated by the winter moon, these men slipped by the sentries completely unnoticed, and they were able to map the camp and steal several horses. Their commander, one Mihail Lajos, had specifically chosen their route so that the freezing wind was at their backs. The sentries, who were wrapped up in their cloaks, couldn't turn their faces into the wind to see the oncoming soldiers or hear the clattering of their harnesses. These were the special forces of the 18th century.
When we think about warfare in the 18th century, we usually imagine lines of men marching toward each other across an open field, sort of fatalistically blasting away at each other while cannonballs whistle overhead.
Everything from their brightly colored uniforms to their weapons and brute force tactics appears to us as untactical, and in fact as untactical as humanly possible, honestly a little bit foolish. But this was also an era when Western militaries began to introduce light infantry and light cavalry, and the tactics they experimented with for these troops would go on to revolutionize warfare during the Age of Napoleon.
What's usually forgotten in this story is the early history of these light troops, how they emerged in the irregular warfare of the Ottoman invasions and an almost forgotten 30-year-long war in Hungary, but also how their tactics were exported around Europe by a group of swashbuckling adventurer mad lads in the 1730s and 40s. This first video, will explain the origins of these troops and their tactics, and it will also tell some of the wild stories of these commanders that led them in this freewheeling era.
In 1759, Mihail Lajos, the commander in this story, published his handbook on light troop tactics entitled Les partisans ou l'art de faire la petite guerre avec succès selon le génie de nos jours, which is the partisan or the art of fighting the petite guerre, the small war, with success according to the genius of our days. And he's a really interesting person. His career is quite emblematic of the martial culture of his era. He was a Hungarian, born in 1723 or 24 in the Principality of Transylvania, which was then ruled by the Hapsburgs, and he was a member of the Protestant lesser nobility. This is significant because the Transylvanian Protestants had a somewhat ambivalent relationship with the Catholic Habsburgs, and he was only the second generation born outside of nominal Ottoman suzerainty in this militarized borderland. It's a little bit complicated, but basically after the Ottomans conquered most of the medieval kingdom of Hungary in the early 16th century, the historical Hungarian crown lands devolved into three distinct entities. There was Royal Hungary and Croatia, which were subject to the Habsburgs, various eyalet's or provinces subject to the Ottomans, and then there was also the Principality of Transylvania, which was nominally independent but vassalized by the Ottomans. Each was mostly ruled by the powerful Hungarian magnates, an aristocratic class, throughout the period, but this division resulted in very different historical trajectories for their societies over the following centuries. Unlike the vehemently Catholic Habsburgs, the Ottomans were quite tolerant of religious dissidents during and after the Reformation, and Transylvania became a haven for Protestantism, Judaism, as well as Unitarianism, which in the context of Ottoman rule was a really interesting attempt at syncretizing the divergent faiths. The region also experienced almost 200 years of major and minor border skirmishes between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. This irregular warfare of light cavalry and light infantry raids was known in German as Kleinkrieg, or Little War, and it has its origins in the Turkish expansion into Anatolia. At least since the 14th century, the Ottomans had employed irregular light cavalry known as ikinciler, or deliler, and the raiding style of warfare of these delis produced a corresponding light cavalry among the Serbians, Croatians, and Hungarians, known as the Hussars. You might have heard of Hussars from the more famous Polish heavy cavalry, but these Balkan Hussars were quite different. They were a product of this endless warfare and often fought with minimal armor, just a saber or lance, a shield, and sometimes a bow. After the conquest, the Hungarian nobility quickly adopted and adapted aspects of Ottoman culture, Ottoman vocabulary, and critical for this topic, Ottoman military tactics. So by the early 17th century, the great Ottoman explorer Evliya Çelebi remarked that the Hungarians are no different from our frontier soldiers, wearing the same dress as they and riding the same thoroughbred horses. By the way, it's really important to mention that the Ottoman war machine was always ethnically and religiously diverse. Many of the earliest Gazi warlord clans, including the Malkoçoğlu, or sons of Malkovich, Evrenos, and Mihailolu, or sons of Michael, were founded by Anatolian and Balkan Christians who allied with the Ottomans. And at least up until the Second Siege of Vienna, Serbians, Hungarians, and Wallachian Christians were always willing to join up with Ottoman armies for opportunities to plunder their northern neighbors. This balance of power shifted in the 1690s during the Great Turkish War. In this 15-year-long war, literally the entirety of Eastern and Central Europe, plus Venice, managed to gather together into a vast holy league sponsored by the Pope to smack the Ottomans.
Think about that. The Ottomans and their Crimean Tatar allies were so powerful, it took 15 years for the collective might of the Hapsburgs, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Holy Roman States, Venice, Hungary, and even Russia to finally overcome them.
The resulting Treaty of Karlowitz transferred Transylvania to the Hapsburgs, and though it was still nominally an autonomous vassal, Austrian governors were sent to rule the fiercely independent Hungarian estates there. Almost immediately, a coalition of discontented nobility, peasants, and former soldiers, led by the ruling Prince of Transylvania, Rakotzi Ferenc, or Francis II Rakotzi, rose up in rebellion against the Habsburgs. And interestingly, Rakotzi was continuing a family tradition. His father had participated in a magnate conspiracy in royal Hungary against Leopold I von Hapsburg way back in 1670. Anyway, Francis's rebellion was part popular religious crusade, part peasant uprising after years of hardship and war, and part aristocratic protest against Habsburg absolutism and land return policies.
Much later in the 19th century, nationalist historians reframed this movement as a proto-national rebellion, and Rakotzi as a national hero. But I don't think there's much evidence for this.
While the Hungarian nation as a concept certainly existed, it was exclusively used in this period by the aristocratic nobility to refer to their elite traditions, rights, and privileges. And in fact, Rakotzi and the Transylvanians were essentially just tapping into a much larger ongoing low-level conflict in royal Hungary between pro-Habsburg, mostly Catholic Hungarians known as Labants, and the Kurucs, who were anti-Habsburg, mostly Protestant insurgents. And many of these Kurucs were dispossessed nobility and disbanded frontier soldiers targeted by corrupt Habsburg administrators, often rightly suspicious of their loyalty. Now, religion certainly played a major role here, but I think that fundamentally these conflicts were mostly about money and power. The Hungarian magnates were always fiercely defensive of their noble prerogatives and control over the land, and they increasingly clashed with Habsburg absolutist attempts to seize land and taxation rights in order to pay for these extremely expensive, decades-long wars against the Ottomans. In some sense, both sides were fully justified in their demands, and the imperial officials could be quite brutal in extracting war contributions. But in any case, the result was almost 30 years of guerrilla warfare in Hungary between the infinitely diverse language and cultural communities there: Hungarians, Serbs, Slovaks, Germans, and mercenaries of all stripes. The Kurucs occasionally sent raids deep into Habsburg Austria, even to the gates of Vienna. And when the Rakotzi's rebellion finally collapsed in 1711, most of the aristocratic Kuruc insurgents transferred allegiance to the Habsburgs in exchange for recognition of their traditional constitution and extensive privileges, including the rights of Protestants, autonomy of the Hungarian Diet, and most especially their immunity from all taxation.
Though Rakotzi died in exile, the Hungarian nobility basically won and were able to maintain their nearly feudal control over their lands and impoverished serfs basically until 1848. In fact, many of the Kurucs leaders ended up becoming later appointed to high positions in the Austrian army.
This conflict has been almost completely forgotten outside of Hungary. But this stew of violence and trauma is really the origin point for the light troop tactics we're talking about here. And they would go on to capture the imagination of Europe just a few decades later.
So Mihai Lajos was born into this context, and his military career was somewhat typical for his class.
He joined a Hussar regiment to fight against the Ottomans when he was just 14 or 15. And then when the war ended, he joined the Bercheny Hussar regiment in the French army just a year later. It's strange to imagine now, but he really grew up in the military surrounded by these Hungarian soldiers and former Kurucs exiles.
I have no idea why he did this. I think that for men like him, there was just nothing and no one for him in Transylvania at the time. So he emigrated and he made his life as a professional soldier.
Now, if there were any question about the value of light troops, it was decisively settled during the War of the Austrian Succession. Light cavalry and infantry were employed by all sides in the conflict, and these Kurucs, Hungarian diaspora soldiers, really formed the core of these regiments. They were put to especially good use by the Austrian Hapsburgs and the Prussian armies of Friedrich the Grosse, or Frederick the Great. Very early in the conflict, Hapsburg Queen Maria Theresa, called upon the frontier militias of her Hungarian and Croatian territories. And these light infantry, known as the Pandurs, became famous for their daring, their mobility, because they didn't carry any tents and slept in their cloaks, and most especially for their looting. These troops were most famously associated with their freewheeling commander, Baron Franz von der Trenck, but they were almost immediately subordinated under the command of one Johann Daniel von Menzel. Menzel was a commander of Hussars who, like Jene, entered military service at an extremely young age, just 12 or 13 years old. He ran away from his bourgeois middle-class family in Leipzig and spent time in practically every army in Eastern Europe, with the Swedes, Saxons, Polish-Lithuanians, and then the Russians. By the 1730s, he was fighting against the Crimean Tatars and the Ottoman Turks, and was even briefly sent as an envoy to the Persian Shah on behalf of the Tsar. So, like all of these men, he learned to ride and to fight in the borderlands, and he used his skills, intelligence, and job hopping to quickly gain promotions. This might sound strange to us today, but in the 18th century, the aristocratic officer class was extremely mobile and easily found contracts in the services of competing empires. When the War of the Austrian Succession started, he left the Russian service and joined the Austrians, who used him and his men to capture Munich in a lightning winter campaign in 1742. Trenck's Pandur light infantry and Menzel's Hussar light cavalry were a shock to Europe, both in terms of their foreign oriental appearance, described as almost Moorish or Chinese due to their strange clothes and long mustaches, but also in their mobility and their irregular tactics.
Basically, they could do things that no one else in Europe could, raiding supply lines, launching ambushes, and storming fortresses at night by climbing over the walls. And by the way, Menzel died the way that he lived. In 1744, he and his men were encamped on the Rhine, and he went out to drunkenly curse at French soldiers across the river, and one of their sharpshooters got him.
Very quickly, armies across Europe responded by raising their own light infantry and cavalry troops, either headed and staffed by Hungarian exiles and former borderland soldiers, or otherwise by young officers and servants who distinguished themselves in dealing with this irregular warfare. So, for example, in 1743, during the French invasion of Bohemia, a 29-year-old groom, someone who's a caretaker of horses, who was serving an infantry colonel, was noticed for his boldness as a horseman. And the man, named Johann Christian Fischer,
ended up forming a unit of valets to fight as the first chasseurs à cheval in the French army. Basically, the Austrian Hussars were always stealing their horses, and so the valets in charge of keeping those horses began to arm themselves with rifles to chase down those Hussars. And this was an altogether novel composite unit with light cavalry and riflemen working together, a combined arms solution to the challenges of Little War. If you've read the Sharp novels by Bernard Cornwell or watched the movies with Sean Bean, Fisher seems like it could have been an inspiration. Though from a lower class background, he was quickly promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he became this sort of swashbuckling master of intelligence gathering. Apparently, at one point, the editor of a newspaper in Frankfurt irritated Louis XV's government, and so Fisher and his men snuck into the city and kidnapped the poor man. Other similar light cavalry infantry combo units soon followed, including Gracines Arquebusières, the Fusiliers de la Molière, the Prussian Jägers, and then the British light horse. Their exact formations varied. The French built units of about 2/3 light infantry and 1/3 light cavalry, and even assigned Le Morières, Fusiliers, a couple of cannons. The British, who were allies of the Hapsburgs and so didn't face their raiding, only formed their first light horse troops in 1745 to deal with the Jacobite uprising in the Scottish Highlands. And Friedrich II was strongly against employing irregular forces, so his Jaegers were initially just mounted scouts, later reforming in 1744 as light infantry skirmishers.
It may be relevant here that in 1741, the Prussians captured a spy ring watching Friedrich the Great's movements. And when tortured, one of them confessed that he had been hired by the Habsburg High Royal Court Council, and specifically the husband of Queen Maria Theresia, to watch his movements in preparation for an attack against him. So the Prussians protested this, obviously, and Habsburg reply, they published a letter denying everything, saying they would never be involved with bandits, and also that if they had been involved with bandits, it was, of course, completely legal according to the laws of war at the time. An assassination against a head of state in this era would have been completely unprecedented, almost unthinkable. But Friedrich really did Maria Theresia dirty, and I wouldn't be surprised if her husband wanted to arrange a Will Smith smackdown for him.
Keep my wife's name out your mouth!
Wow, dude.
Yes.
Hey, this is Post-Production Acer. If you like this goofy content, please scan the QR code and find ways to support my work.
Anyway, after the war, the Prussians and French employed their light regiments as border police, and also to hunt down highwaymen and smugglers like the famous Louis Mandrin. They apparently disguised 500 of them as peasants to sneak into the independent Duchy of Savoy to kidnap him.
It's worth taking a step back to think about what's going on here. Guys like Menzel, Trenck, and Fischer were problem solvers. They were able to mobilize some of the most frightening troops Europe had to offer, and they were able to get in and out of places that ordinary troops couldn't, and make unwanted people disappear. But they were also very characteristic of the extremely personalized quality of warfare in this period in Europe.
And you'll notice that all of the military units I've mentioned have names like Fischer's Chasseurs or the Bertscheni Hussars. And that's because up until about the French Revolution, and much longer in the German and Russian lands, almost all military regiments were raised, organized, and usually led by a proprietor or Inhaber in German. Each regiment was a distinct band with distinct uniforms and a distinct sense of identity separate from the army they served. They also functioned a bit like a corporation. So profits from salaries and loot were shared within the regiment, but the lion's share went to the proprietor, who invested the capital required to set up the unit. And this is a really ancient way of organizing an army. Beneath an extremely thin veneer of uniformity and unity of purpose, the pre-modern army was a jangly, shambolic colossus. Though formally bound together by aristocratic oaths of allegiance and hierarchy, in reality, officers were constantly clashing with each other, dueling, or even spying for the enemy. and the regiments managed themselves independently for most of the time. This was especially the case for irregular troops, which in many cases received no standardized training, spoke a different native language from the rest of their army, and frequently received no pay at all, and so needed to survive by extorting the local populations. This system was even more extreme in the east, with the Russians and the Ottomans each relying extensively on autonomous militarized communities to police their borders and assist on military campaigns. This was the case for the Cossacks, but also for lesser-known groups like the Tatars, Kalmyks, Albanians, and arguably the Janissaries themselves. But that's a topic for another video.
The best comparison for this might be to imagine that your national government wants to improve their military capabilities outside the bounds of respectability, let's say. So what they do is they hire foreign gangsters, which is exactly who these people were. Everyone knew it. In this case, they were Hungarians, and they bring their foreign Hungarian gang member friends, call themselves a regiment, and they even bring their foreign scary gang costumes. And this seems like a great idea to the people in charge. It's extremely cheap. You don't need to pay these people most of the time. As long as you're at war, they'll just plunder and pillage everyone who lives nearby. And this is exactly how states in the first half of the 18th century mobilized military power. And it's still how some states continue to operate today. This is also where Yene enters the picture. He seems to have been stationed on the Rhine, where he learned cartography, which at that point was an entirely novel military art. This is a point we'll get back to in the next video. As you can probably guess, this freewheeling era of Hussar plunderers couldn't last forever. States needed to find more enduring and reliable ways of mobilizing irregular warfare tactics. And in the next video, we'll see how regular European armies immediately during and after the 7 Years' War institutionalized this Balkan style of war.
As a final word, AI is taking over the YouTube history space. You can now find very successful channels with 500,000 views on each video that are entirely AI-generated, AI images, AI narration, but even AI facts, AI stories. This is disgusting, unethical, and lazy. But you, the viewer, have the power to stop the slop. If you value original content by actual humans, like and subscribe, and you can change the YouTube space.
Festett szabját, piac olyanoknak, kik zászlód alatt